Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's Policy Exchange Fringe at Conservative Party Conference on what is, certainly in Hertfordshire, a very wet and slightly bleak Sunday morning. No reflection, of course, on the conference itself. For those who don't know anything about Policy Exchange, it is Westminster's leading think tank, and last month we launched our Health and Social Care Unit's new work programme, the Build Back Better programme. We focused on a number of important areas, including social care reform, accountability in health and public health services, and the new hospitals programme, and how we can build some really exciting and dynamic new hospitals for the future. This morning's Fringe is kindly sponsored by Susan and the team at Alzheimer's Research UK. It is under the title of Patchwork Quilt or Powerhouse, how to make the NHS a global leader in clinical trials. What we're going to do this morning is focus the conversations on how we can speed up access to future trials and new ways of working, and what lessons can we learn from the COVID-19 approaches that we've taken and lock those in for the future. I'm delighted to be joined by three excellent and high caliber speakers. The Minister for Innovation, Lord James Bethell. James became Minister for Innovation on the 9th of March 2020, 2 weeks, of course, before national lockdown. Extraordinary time to become a Minister for Innovation, and an incredible journey that it's been for the last 6 months. And James, from all of us at Policy Exchange, a massive thank you for all of the work that you've been doing in the last 6 months on the COVID response. It's been an unbelievable effort, and we just wanted to pass on our thanks to you for all of that hard work that's been going in. I'm looking forward to the discussion on the recovery trial and other elements this morning. Dr. Susan Kohlhaas from Alzheimer's Research UK has 10 years experience in medical research, most recently with the MS Society. Alzheimer's Research has an unbelievable mission to bring about the first life-changing dementia treatment by 2025. And I'm sure we can all sort of endorse that mission and wish them every success with it. And our final speaker is Sheuli Porkess from the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industries. The ABPI is the industry at the forefront of working with the NHS and academics to try and support finding a COVID-19 vaccine. Sheuli has a wealth of experience working as a clinician within the NHS and within the industry, and is also a fellow of pharmaceutical medicine in the UK. So an excellent panel this morning, a really important discussion at this current time with the COVID-19 pandemic and second wave upon us. And if I may, I'd like to start with the Minister to sort of kick us off with some opening remarks. We'll then move through Susan and Sheuli, and then I will moderate a session. If you'd like to ask a question, please do submit them. And later on, I will try and pick out some of the most pertinent ones, and we will be wrapping up at about 11 o'clock. James, if I may, I'd like to ask you to start our remarks this morning. Thank you very much for joining us on Sunday morning, and I look very much looking forward to the session.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you very much indeed to Policy Exchange for pulling together this really important panel, and also to Susan and Alzheimer's for helping to support it. It's a really important cause. And you know, the funny thing is, I am new to the life sciences gig, but this issue, the one of clinical trials, is the one that, without doubt, I feel the most motivated about. I have a really powerful and strong feeling that this is something that we need to address. And I felt it the moment it crossed my desk. And so I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes explaining why. And there's going to be others who can speak more thoughtfully and much more experience on the practicalities and the clinical dimensions of clinical trials. But I want to put it in some kind of bigger context. I think part of it is my own business career, which in the 90s was at the Ministry of Sound, when the .com, as it was then, way of working really began to impact the way we did business. And this idea of iteration became a really key driver of business thinking. And we had people who flew in from the West Coast, and I flew over to the West Coast, and the old stodgy way of doing of writing papers, and suddenly gave way to this concept of the velocity of innovation. And the speed with which you could test something out, adapt, change, and then remarket something became the key driver of success. And we suddenly all began to understand that trying things out, learning from what you've done, and then changing and adapting, that was critically important. And that is embedded now in the way that I think about progress. And funnily enough, that is a view that was reinforced on reading Matt Ridley's book on innovation, which I highly recommend to anyone who hasn't done. And in a very polite, courteous way, what he does there is to slightly take down the cult of the individual, the cult of the inventor, and replace it with this idea that, he's from the north, he's sort of northeastern perspective, that hard work, slog and collaboration actually are the drivers of innovation, not amazing flashes of inspiration and individual breakthroughs. I mean, there are some exceptions to that, but when we think about the big drivers of innovation in energy, transport, public health, and he goes through all the industrial sectors, it is iteration and trial and error that is really the driver of innovation. And I know that from my political career as well, where we use field tests a lot to try and understand in a constructive way how the public react to ideas and messages. So that's why I think of clinical trials as being so important. And it frustrates me enormously that the current way things work are, of course, we do very well on clinical trials in Britain. We are rightly proud of the regulatory framework and the role of the NHS and the investment that pharmaceutical companies put in clinical trials in the UK, and we have to be sure that we don't fall back in that. But overall, my strong instincts are that it takes far too long to do a big clinical trial. It costs far too much. And the scale on which they are done is far, far, far too small. And I hate to sound giganticist and out of proportion on this, but my instincts are we should be doing 10 times as many clinical trials as we do today, with 10 times the size of people involved. And we should be trying to move many, many times more quickly and at a fraction of the cost. And I saw a proof point of this during COVID, where the recovery panel, has just blown the whole sector out of the water, because the sheer scale, 133,000 people signed up for it, and some of the individual trials had tens of thousands of people involved, and it moved incredibly quickly, and much quicker than anywhere else in the world. And dexamethasone has been one of the really big breakthrough therapeutics, and getting that mobilized has been fantastic. And the collaboration right across the NHS sector has been fantastic, and the results have gone to prove it. I must tell you, though, that I had looked at other clinical trial spreadsheets where they were trying to recruit, 25 people, and week after week we'd be like, yeah, we've now recruited 4 people, and by next week we're hoping to be on 5 or 6. The good news of recovery, there was bad news as well, and there was a real struggle at times to get important new molecules into the field and tested, and that gave me a real insight as to how things can work if they don't go so well. And there are other areas of our COVID response in terms of the sheer scale, the surveillance that we did, the vaccine trials that we're doing. Just the massive speed and scale at which we can just demonstrates what can be done when we focus on it. So, like anyone in my job, I'm the Minister for Innovation and Life Sciences. Of course, I want to be part of a whole new generation of research and to support some kind of massive new industrial revolution of medicines. But I genuinely believe that this question of clinical trials and trying to get them facilitated more quickly, cheaper and faster is a key to unlocking that. And I do have a personal dimension to that as well. My father had Parkinson's, and for 10 years I curated his care, and he was very passionate about being involved in clinical trials. Many on this call would have met people like it. He was up for anything. He really was. And putting the patient at the center of that process is another thing that I can't help feeling is really key. Not just to the efficacy of the trials, because patients have a huge amount of insight, but also in terms of mobilizing people, getting them to step up for trials, and also making it a rewarding experience for researchers. So those are my framing remarks. I can't help hoping that we can somehow augur a new investment and age of new medicines, particularly for medicines that touch the mass population. And my observation is that we're doing really well on medicines that touch small, refined groups, and it's a huge blessing that we can help people who previously, would not have had support. But where the clinical trials cul-de-sac or bottleneck really hits us hard is getting medicines that touch on whole population problems. And that's what I think could be the big benefit from a renewed approach to clinical trials. Thank you, Richard.
James, thank you very much indeed. Some really, really good themes there to start us off: collaboration, speed, scale, patient engagement, all of which I think are really going to be really important parts of this morning's discussion. So thank you very much for that and your sharing your experience. If I may, I'm going to turn to Susan from Alzheimer's Research UK to provide the sort of medical charity perspective. And Susan, it'd be great to have your early remarks to see how you see the environment and what you think we should be doing more of in the future.
Great, thank you, Richard. And thank you for Policy Exchange for hosting this event. We think this is a really important topic for people affected by dementia and actually just everybody in the UK as well. So you'll be aware that dementia is the leading cause of death in the UK, and it's really the only major cause of death where we don't have treatments to prevent or slow down or cure the condition. So at AR UK, we're really passionate about making sure that people and their families benefit from the research investment that has gone in at the front end. So the UK is one of the world's leading investors in dementia research, has invested a huge amount in the fundamental science behind dementia research. And what we really want to see is breakthroughs in clinical trials so that people can benefit from that research investment that's gone in. So there are some real challenges in dementia clinical trials specifically. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about a few of the solutions that we think could be implemented reasonably simply, and actually put the UK at the front of the pack and as a world leader in running dementia clinical trials. So clinical trials are particularly challenging in the field of dementia because, there are a number of reasons for this. So the current thinking is that people will benefit most from treatments at the early stages of their disease. So often when you do clinical trials, you're looking for people who are at the very, very early stages of their disease or who may not even have symptoms yet. And it's very, very difficult to identify people at that stage. So our current system isn't set up to do that particularly well. There are other reasons that dementia trials are large and expensive. So we have high rates of screening failure because we're often looking for very, very specific people to go into clinical trials. So we have to screen a lot of people, and a lot of people then can't get through aren't eligible to take part in a clinical trial. That's one of the reasons why we have slow recruitment. And as we know, slow recruitment can really disproportionately increase the cost of running clinical trials. And also in dementia, we're needing to measure, we have to wait until people get worse to measure whether a treatment is having an effect. So often the trials have to be a little bit longer than other fields such as cancer. And that is something that we have to manage. So what we really need to do in the field of dementia, but I would argue actually across the UK in all of the fields, is find the right people at the right time to take part in clinical trials. There are also, broader issues within the UK, and Lord Bethell alluded to these, around sort of research capacity within the NHS, but also slow and lengthy contracting arrangements that disincentivize companies to come and do their trials in the UK. But we're beginning to see some positive signs and movement in the right direction. So that's really promising. The life sciences industrial strategy and subsequent updates have started to address some of these issues. There have been brain health clinics that are developed and rolling out that are in a position to create a competitive advantage in the UK. And what we really know that we need is data-enabled research. So we know that there are an increasing number of clinical trials that require biomarker data in their inclusion criteria. And we know that the NHS doesn't routinely collect this data as part of its dementia diagnosis. So what we know needs to happen is that data-enabled research will be key to putting the UK at the centre of being able to recruit quickly and move into a competitive advantage as a world leader in dementia trials. And what that looks like is a clinical trials network that is collecting samples and scans on people who are at early stages of cognitive impairment or right before or as they're being diagnosed with dementia. And that will mean that we can recruit more quickly, more accurately to clinical trials and do them in a much better, more efficient way. We already know, as I've said, the UK is investing heavily in the fundamental science that has opened up lots of new ideas about how we might be able to treat dementia and target the diseases in the future. And so further investment now in developing and running clinical trials will make sure that we can target that early investment into actual treatments and benefits for people with dementia.
Brilliant, Susan. Thank you very much indeed for that, and also for starting to propose some potential solutions around the use of data, the use of networks. And this theme that often comes back is this issue around the speed of recruitment and the ability to do the recruitment faster. It was mentioned by James in his earlier remarks about some of the challenges in getting patients into trials, and it's also reflected in what you've said, not only from the patient engagement perspective, but also the data and the way the system is structured. So that's again incredibly helpful. Sheuli, from an industry perspective, it would be great to have your remarks about how you currently see the system and any reflections you've had, particularly from recent months, about how things have been working.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you Policy Exchange and Susan and the team for organising this. It's such an important topic at any time, but particularly at the moment. So it's great to be able to have the discussion. From where I see things, I mean, we talk about the life sciences being a sector that will be key to how the UK emerges from COVID, not just in delivering treatments and vaccines, but also how the UK fulfills its ambition to be a science superpower. And the UK has the potential to be a world leader in clinical research. We know clinical trials bring an economic benefit to the NHS, and in 2018-19 there was an estimated income of about 355 million. Which actually corresponded to about 46,000 patients in that same time period having the chance to take part in clinical research across many diseases, so cancer, heart disease, diabetes, neurological diseases, and many others. And for me as a doctor, it's critical we get this right. Where are we now? You know, the UK's R&D response to COVID has been world leading, with delivering really rapid answers about existing medicines to see if they would make a difference to COVID. However, we have seen a negative impact on research in non-COVID clinical trials, with many trials of innovative cutting-edge medicines having to be paused. And this is because the provision of research is absolutely dependent on the NHS, and we saw that research staff were being redeployed to the front line and the COVID-19 research was being prioritised. Over the last few months, we've been working alongside our members, government, across the sector to get these non-COVID studies restarted through working really closely with the NIHR advisory group and implementation group. And a huge amount of work has gone on with colleagues in the MHRA, HRA, the research and development teams, and NIHR. And we have made some progress. So over half of commercial studies are now open in some form, but they're not fully open and recruiting as they were previously, and only a third have recruited new patients since June. And really reflecting on those last few months, as you said, Richard, and in the context of the second wave, it's now clear we really need to focus on what we're doing to restart research and focus on those elements that will make a difference between now and spring and provide resilience for the future. We need to work with the NHS to make sure we keep those trials open that are open, restart what we can, and lay the strategic foundations from which we can then transform the UK's clinical research environment in a sustainable way, and ensuring that research becomes embedded in clinical care. And this concept of restarting research as being a foundation stone for transforming UK research is the focus of our report, our ABPI clinical trials report, which will be published next week. And in that report, we used 2018 data as a pre-COVID benchmark from which we need to build back to and then beyond. And there are sort of 4 key recommendations, which I'll be delighted to expand on later. So one is about restarting and restoring research in the UK across all disease areas, transforming the UK clinical research environment with investment to increase those levels beyond pre-COVID levels, making sure that all patients, wherever they are, have the opportunity to be involved with and engaged in research, and making research and innovation central to the UK's trade strategy. So I'm really delighted for the discussion and happy to pick up on any of these points in the next part of the discussion.
Sheuli, that's unbelievably helpful, and those recommendations are very timely given the conversation this morning. I think we can sort of take those recommendations and actually use them as a springboard to have some of the conversation this morning. I was also struck by your point on the economy and clinical trials and the economic impacts that research has, in particular as it's also regional in nature in the UK. I think it's a really important point. And also on the non-COVID trials. Now, there's a real focus at the moment on non-COVID care and how we keep non-COVID care going, but also non-COVID related trials and research also needs to, as you say, be maintained and restarted as soon as possible. That was really, really helpful as a starting point. What I wanted to do now is to turn to some questions and discussions. And I wanted to start actually at the international level, if I may, and maybe Susan, I could start with you on this one, to get some reflections from you, and indeed I'd be very interested in other panelists' views on which countries you see doing things particularly innovative or sort of pioneering that you think we could actually learn from as we proceed. So Susan, can I start with you, and then I might ask the other panelists to come in if they wish to.
Sure. I mean, one of the things we hear a lot, so we talk to lots of companies who run clinical trials, and what we're hearing is that in the US in particular, they're doing this well. They're sort of engaging community networks and encouraging trial participation across different communities, to the point that they're thinking outside the box and doing really innovative things around people's lives, so that participation in research is seen as part of people's lives. And what we're hearing from companies is that they love the quality of the research that's done in the UK. Clinical trials and clinical trial sites in the UK are world leading in terms of quality, but it's just some of the bureaucracy involved in negotiating contracts. For example, negotiating contracts with different NHS sites rather than a single contract that cause an increase in costs and an increase in effort for companies to invest in trials in the UK. So we're hearing that companies are starting to think about going to other sites where they maybe see the quality as not quite as good as the UK, but because the cost is reduced, that they're making that trade-off. So that's what we need to try and make sure that we reduce the costs and maintain that quality.
There's a scale and a speed bit to that. And then, James, I wanted to bring you in, if I could, on the patient-public engagement in trials, and how Sheuli also made this point about how we can get better information to the public about what trials are available and actually reduce those friction points and barriers to getting patients involved.
Yes, well, the data point, there are several aspects to it. One is data, and at the moment, my perception is that a lot of the recruitment is done individually by consultants and specialists in secondary care. And that is going to be entirely right for some types of clinical trials, particularly where there are highly specialist or rare conditions, where there's frankly not that many people who are going to be candidates for the trial. But I'm interested in sometimes when there are broader trials, and COVID's a good example of that. And Susan, in things like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's and dementia diseases, there are millions of people who could be in trials. There are a lot more about the individual choices of people are really important. And there are people who who are both expert in their own condition, but also are very keen to come forward. We want to have the platforms that make that as accessible as possible. And those platforms are emerging, and the trials platforms that we have are getting better. But I would like them to be dramatically better, for them to be on a national scale, and for them to be plugged into the rest of the NHS's data, so that we make sure that we are channeling as many people into the right decisions as possible. And that's got benefits for both the clinicians, who can get exactly the right candidates and have the scale of trials that they need. And it's also good for the patients, because it means that they've got the opportunity to step forward if they like, and also that they are in the right trial for the right condition. And there's also a political dimension to this, Richard. You know, we need to offer people the best opportunities available, and not to be driven by producer constraints and by the system. And we live in a world where consumer choice and voter supremacy are really high in people's minds, and we need to open up the area of clinical trials to a more patient-led, consumer-orientated approach, I think.
That's great. And we've had a question in actually from a doctor who's asked, as a doctor, a recruitment issue is medical academics leading trials often don't practice clinically much, so have difficulty accessing patients. Is that something the panel would concur with, and are there any sort of solutions or ideas or thoughts on that? I'm not sure whether it's James or Susan or Sheuli. Would anyone want to come in on that question?
I'll let Sheuli go first.
Yeah,
Sheuli.
so I think I think to use the words that Susan said at the beginning, it's about being able to find and recruit the right patient. And for me, it's whichever kind of healthcare professional you are. So whether you are a clinical academic or a GP in a GP surgery, whichever, it's finding that. And that really then comes down to how do we have that data enabled clinical research, which enables patients to be identified, be it through their routine care or through specific interventions. There is work going on to develop patient recruitment centres, and we've been involved in that work as it develops to try and accelerate recruitment. I think health data and really using the data to help patients be identified and then offered the chances is a key thing. And I think there's also something that I know we'll probably come on to lessons from COVID in a bit more further down the discussion. But one of the specific things we're seeing is that as patients don't physically come into their clinics, the usual processes where a research nurse and the research team would be able to identify patients and sit and talk them through the research aren't working, they're just not available. So actually, as the research community, we need to reimagine what does that look like? How do you get the information to patients and enable them to talk it through with someone to work out if it's the right thing for them? So I think it's a really good point, but actually, especially in this COVID time, we're having to think about it even more. It's even more important because we can't rely on the way that we used to do things.
James, you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, no, Sheuli makes a really important point there. I mean, this isn't a small thing, this is massive. Long COVID is a really good example of that. On long COVID, we have people who don't know that they've had the disease, maybe have never been near a GP, certainly weren't near a hospital, and yet are now suffering from neurological or cardiac issues. And how do we find those people? And the old model of the consultant in the hospital having an expertise and bringing people who are literally from the hospital bed into the trial, that's not how things work anymore. And we need to be much more creative. I mean, I'd pay tribute to schemes like Be Part of Research and Digitrials. I mean, they are coming on really hard and strong, but I'm just totally maximalist about this. We just need to be 10 times better than we are at the moment, not 10% better.
And Susan, from an Alzheimer's dementia perspective, is there anything on the patient engagement piece that is particularly you'd like to raise at this point?
Yeah, so there is a scheme that is run by the NIHR called Joint Dementia Research, which we are a supporter of. So people can sort of register with that scheme, and then that's a way for them to find out about trials that they might be eligible for. They can keep their data within that, or their kind of contact information updated as well, so they can be contacted proactively by researchers. I think the point that Lord Bethell makes, though, that the scale, this needs to be scaled up and quickly, because I think what we want are as many people as possible taking part in research, because we know that that can lead to better outcomes, regardless of whether you're on a placebo or not, but also better outcomes in terms of finding treatments that work.
I ask about the COVID-19 recovery trial, which has come up a couple of times already, and I might ask James you first on this with your reflections so far on. It obviously has had real success today. Are there learnings that we think we can take from that and expand, for the future to do that jump that you're referring to?
Yes, I think there are two or three. I mean, I wish Martin was on the call, and he would be more insightful than me. Firstly, scale. It was just massive. And secondly, just the huge amount of buy-in it got from hospitals up and down the country. Martin has a very good graph that shows, which hospitals recruited, and there were some hospitals that delivered, massively. But what is striking about it is very few hospitals delivered. And so there was a huge amount of collaboration. Now, this is an important point, because for some sectors, and this is what people complain about when they're trying to recruit for clinical trials, they're only working with 2, 3, 4, 5 hospitals at a time, and they are completely blind to potential candidates in other parts of the country. Well, this is crazy in this day and age, that simply through the lack of organisation and the lack of a platform, you can't reach candidates up and down the country. And so I think there is an argument for saying that we should be using the recovery platform as something that we actually flip into part of our future response, and we build on it and create that as a long-term platform for a lot of clinical trials in the future. And I think that a lot of hospitals found it useful as well, because they wanted to play their role, but couldn't individually necessarily sponsor their own clinical trials program. But recovery gave them the opportunity to plug into something that was credible and thoughtful, and had the best medicines in it. And that gave clinicians on the front line, who are critically important to this, an opportunity to participate, which I think they found very rewarding. So I think there was a lot of good things in recovery that we should be using more of in the future. And I'm hopeful that that will be a platform that we can expand on.
Brilliant. And Sheuli, from an industry perspective, would you concur with that and sort of a lot of these processes in? I mean, it's obviously a particular trial for a particular set of circumstances, right? So what's your industry view?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good time to reflect on actually what happened, and then how do we transfer that across to other diseases. So how I see it was, we've had answers to questions about, do these established medicines work for a new disease?
Data is a massive issue in the NHS. And it's really difficult. And we have these legacy systems, and they don't talk to each other very well. An interesting thing that happened through COVID was that we didn't throw the rule book out. We didn't tear up all the red tape and just have a free for all. But we did make it really clear that there was a presumption that data should be shared wherever legally possible. And that signal to the marketplace led to a dramatic increase in the amount of data that was shared. So it was a cultural tweak rather than a legal tweak. And when we do our post-match analysis, even now, people speak of that as being one of the most profound and, by the way, exhilarating things that happened during COVID. That people who previously would have been hesitant and worried and concerned suddenly felt, let's just give this a go, and we'll use our best judgment and professional standards to assess whether this is reasonable or not. And as a result, a lot more data was shared, and that was one of the reasons why candidates were more easily identified and passed on to the recovery trial. We're really keen to try and capture that. Now, there is a huge amount of data being generated at the moment through recovery, through all the surveillance on ONS and React we're doing, through the vaccines program, and through test and trace. And one of the big challenges we've got is to try and capture all of that data and make sure that we don't create sort of loads of legacy systems that don't talk to each other. And there is a big project to try and bring that all together. But I would really pay tribute to those on the front line who step forward and tried to figure out ways of sharing data better. We're very interested in the work of Ben Goldacre, who has got his own open source platform. That is a really interesting way of using a trusted, thoughtful platform to share data across the health service. And I would regard data as being one of the main drivers of the life sciences proposition going forward. So the way that I see it is that we have these big engines of innovation, genomics, artificial intelligence, and big data. In order to make those engines work, we had some drivers of change, and that getting better clinical trials is one of the key drivers of change. Better regulation, so that's getting the MHRA to be a sort of British Airways Gold Card standard regulator. And investing massively in diagnostics, which we're doing in a very big way at the moment, as you know. And the fourth is digitization. And getting those four things right will mean that the innovation works. And digitization is different to big data, but that is a really, really big challenge for us. And none of it can work properly if we don't get that bit right.
Thank you very much for that. And Susan, from a dementia perspective, you've obviously got the challenge on data between health and social care data and that connectivity points. Is there any, that's obviously a major problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a real issue. I think also the collection of data isn't there in the numbers we need them to recruit to trials. So we know that a fraction of people who are diagnosed with dementia are actually getting scans and biomarker, sort of biological data collected. So then when it comes to trials, it's just harder to identify the people who might be eligible. One of the things I'd love to go back to though is the recovery trial, and I guess the lessons that we learned through COVID. So one of the things we've looked at Alzheimer's Research UK is what we've learned from the trials that have kept going outside of the recovery trial. And one of the things that we found really innovative are some of the trials that have brought care and trials outside of acute settings and into more community-based settings. And I think this would be incredibly beneficial for us to think about this in the future of running trials, because over the next couple of years, it will protect participants. We know that disproportionately people who have been at risk of and died of COVID are people with dementia. So I am assuming that over the next year or so, we're not going to want lots of people going into acute settings for clinical research. So it will help to protect participants. I think it will increase the diversity of people who take part in clinical trials. Particularly when you think about dementia and people potentially needing support to get to trial sites and to take part in trials. They need potentially a carer there with them. Traveling long distances might not be something that they can do. They might also have comorbidities. So I think it will sort of increase the number of people who feel that they can take part in clinical trials. And I think moving trials more into community-based settings, into home settings, using digital monitoring potentially will actually make trials faster and cheaper as well. So it will reduce the number of data points that you have to collect. So, I think this is a really interesting thing that we've started to see because COVID has necessitated this approach. And I think, we're really keen to kind of see this moving forward as well.
Sheuli, can I bring you in on these points?
Yeah, so just to echo what's been said before, as ABPI, we've been looking at, what is the promise of UK health data? What could we do to unlock it? And there are 6 key areas that we see. So One is reducing fragmentation in the UK health data landscape. So how do you get the different bits joined up and describe that in a way that companies can go, all right, this is what the UK can offer. Increase efficiency of the data access process. So how do you get actually be able to use the data? Key one that we've just been talking about is use that data to help how you design, how you find patients, how you recruit for your clinical trials and how you do the trials. Enhance data transparency, use that health data to demonstrate the value of interventions. And whilst doing all of those 5, absolutely, the 6th one is making sure we've got high standards of governance. So that sort of runs through the governance piece, obviously runs through all of the 5 other ones to make sure we do it in the right way. So, and I think, yeah, COVID has only echoed. We put this together in a report that sort of came out Q1 of this year. And I think looking back on this now, I go, yeah, COVID's only amplified the need for us to get those things right.
Brilliant. And James?
Well, Sheuli, the ABPI report earlier this year was brilliant, and I'm really looking forward to your report, I think next week, you said. So thank you very much indeed for your pressure. Another report I would recommend is Professor Mike Richards' report on diagnostic hubs. And these things are linked, I think. And in fact, I would be interested in Susan and Sheuli's perspectives on this if you have them, because Susan's entirely right. You know, one of the things about COVID is we didn't want people going to hospital because, you know, for obvious reasons, because we don't want them catching COVID. So the idea, so that we kept testing out of hospitals on the whole wherever we could, and that put a new emphasis to the long-standing idea for having diagnostic hubs, and those hubs can perhaps be somewhere where recruitment can take place. And so I'm certainly really interested in Mike Richards' thoughts. David Wells, head of pathology at NHS, is building on those ideas. I think it's a really rich vein of thinking, and we're keen to get some action behind it. Using that initiative as a way of expanding and rethinking the way in which recruitment is done at a very early stage of disease, and also within the community, and not just in secondary care, but also in primary care, I think would be one way of trying to build some capability here. I'd be interested in Susan and Sheuli's views on that.
Who wants to come in first? Susan?
I'm happy. I mean, I would completely agree with that, and particularly when you think about the likelihood that treatments are likely to work at an earlier stage of disease. Having the infrastructure and support there to diagnose early, and then having research embedded within that process would be, you know, is a really, really helpful step forward in making progress in treatments for dementia.
Sheuli?
Yeah, one of the challenges we're seeing at the moment with Restart is that patients who, so for trials trying to restart, those that need patients to have, for example, a scan, are running into problems because there's a limited amount of scanning facilities available, and there's waiting lists that need to be addressed. And when you've got research patients and also patients who need it as part of their routine care, there's pressure on the system there. So I think if we can reimagine how we do that, whether it's for diagnosis or monitoring, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there to say, actually, for research, if you need a scan in order to show that you can be, you know, you are eligible to be part of a study, we will make sure you get the scan and you don't have to wait till a stage, especially, you know, in the situation Susan describes. You know, if you're asking someone to wait for a long time, it might be that wait means that they become ineligible clinically. So I think there's a lot of value of discussing this further, because I think we need these different sorts of approaches to take us forward now.
Excellent, thank you very much. Very important. The Richards report from last week, definitely well worth a read for everyone watching this. In our last few minutes, before I ask each of the participants to just provide some final reflections, I'd like to ask a question about health inequalities and about diversity of participation in trials. And I'd like any reflections from the panelists about, as we talk about recruitment and ensuring equity of access, whether there are approaches or models or engagement mechanisms that we can propose that would actually ensure that our trials are as diverse and as available as possible. Susan, can I come to you from a dementia perspective first, perhaps, and then I'll bring others in.
Yeah, and I think this is an area that sort of quite urgently really needs to be looked at, because when we look at trial participation in the UK, across the UK, it's not proportionate to the population that we have here, and there's a worry that if you're testing treatments on the disproportionate part of the population, you're not going to be finding treatments that work for everybody, or you might be missing side effects on a proportion of the population, and then when a treatment becomes available, you know, there might be some issues with that. I think that for dementia trials, more women than men are affected by dementia. I think we're sort of okay on the gender split, but I think people from ethnic minority backgrounds tend not to be recruited to trials. Apart from schemes like joint dementia research, I think this is something that we as a collective need to look at and find ways to recruit. And it might be more community-based recruiting methods help to increase increase the diversity on clinical trials. I think that's something that quite urgently needs to be looked at.
So anyone else? Sheuli, do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I'm very happy to. In addition to what Susan said, I think for me it's really important that we find ways of patients and public being able to contribute to the design of research, whether that's what you're going to measure and how you're going to measure it in the trial, or actually how are you going to recruit those patients, making sure you've actually got those that patient and public input early on, so that your trial's going to be relevant and you can get the right people into the trial is critical. And it's an area we've been working a lot with AMRC and NIHR on over the last few years. And actually we have our annual conference on this topic Wednesday, the next 3 Wednesdays in October, called Pioneering Partnerships, where we will look at how can we together as charity and industry and the NIHR work together to get patients and public involved in research, which will lead to better designed research that can then help to address some of the issues we've just talked about. So,
excellent, thank you. And James?
I'd endorse everything that Susan and Sheuli said. I mean, the health inequalities issues in the UK have been thrown into such vivid relief by COVID, and I don't need to rehearse all of those, but boy, oh boy, it's really been a graphic illustration of the costs of health inequality. When it comes to clinical trials, there are 2 things that I've come across. One is clearly we've really struggled to get all the right groups represented in our clinical trials. I mean, the statistics on that are quite challenging. I got a little bit tired of people saying to me, but we've got Born in Bradford. I mean, I know Born in Bradford is great, but that is not the answer to the challenge of trying to get a representative spread of people from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds and from all sorts of ages, and also from all elements of the healthcare system, primary and secondary. Secondly, the phrase hard to reach communities, I've been challenged on in a way that I think is really interesting. And the point made to me there was, it's not hard to reach communities, it's that our clinical trials are hard to reach. And I haven't quite figured out what that entirely means, but I suspect there's a strong kernel of truth in that. One group that have done really well on this, and it is a vivid example of what is needed to be done in order to crack this, are NHS blood and transplant. So they have needed to recruit people with very high titers in order to get convalescent plasma. And you have a very high titer of convalescent plasma if you have the disease really heavily, basically. So you need, the best people are people who are a bit overweight, who really got hit hard and spent a couple of weeks in an ICU unit. And then have come out and are feeling better and can give blood. Well, the ethnic profile of that is reasonably clear. And they've recruited a former head of passenger branding from Virgin Atlantic. to do targeted marketing at the Asian community to track down those people. And they're doing really well. They've really put a lot of thought into it, and are finding exactly the right people. So it can be done if you put your mind to it, but you've really got to focus on it and think about it and recruit the right kind of people who have the skills to be able to do that. And so hats off to Betsy and the team at BT who have been doing that.
Great stuff. Great stuff. As we move into the last couple of minutes, I'm going to ask each of the panelists in the reverse order to which we started. So we'll start with Sheuli, then go to Susan, and then go to James, to just provide some final reflections on this morning's conversations, and then I will wrap up this roundtable discussion. Sheuli.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for a really, really good discussion. Loads of super important points covered. I mean, for me, it's clear that we need to get this right for patients. We need to have a future-facing, evidence-based NHS where science and research are integrated with providing care, and all patients and all healthcare professionals have the opportunity to get involved in research. And for me, that's the key to then having a globally competitive clinical research system that will attract that innovative research, that commercial research, and build the UK as a science superpower.
Brilliant, thank you. Susan.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I think thank you again for hosting the event. Really, a reflection from me is I think now is the time for us to be looking at this. So I think this is an amazing time. You know, just as we're starting to come out of COVID, we've seen some fantastic innovations over the last 6 months. I'm sure we will see some more over the next 6 months. What we need to do is look at what's happened and where, and then figure out how we can reimagine clinical trials and research going forward. And I think we've learned a lot of really great lessons, and we've seen a lot of really great progress in that space because of COVID. And you know, let's not lose that. Let's build on that and build ourselves into a world leader here.
Thank you. James.
Well, Sheuli stole my key point, which is having patient-focused clinical trials, which is absolutely key and a big part of my pitch. Sheuli, it's great to hear you making that point. And Susan's right. COVID has been a storm that's blown the clinical trials fleet across the ocean, and we don't want it sort of falling back. But my point would be, so it will therefore be slightly different, which is, it is also incredibly important for Britain's life sciences proposition overall. And we have a proposition to the businesses and the healthcare system we've got in the UK already, and also for those who are thinking about investing in the UK. And that proposition is particularly important at a time of transition and at a time when we're going into a recession. And I kind of alluded to this, but I really do think that our overall life sciences mission is about early intervention. And that's why clinical trials and diagnostics are so closely linked. It is about empowering those engines of innovation, genomics, artificial intelligence, and big data. And clinical trials is the key delivery mechanism for innovation and insight. And it needs things like digitization, regulation, and diagnostics to be working to happen. And these things are all part of a piece, and they're glued together. We can't just fix clinical trials and hope that on its own will do it, nor can we focus on clinical trials and try and mend it without thinking about these other component pieces. Nonetheless, clinical trials is the thing that I am particularly focused on, and I'm really determined to get it right. So Richard, thank you very much indeed for hosting us here.
It's great. It's great to hear that focus, James. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all three panelists for their contributions this morning. A huge amount of ground covered. I'm delighted to say this has been recorded, so it can be watched back, because I think there's so much rich content in here for people to see. But given it's just ticked past 11 o'clock, I'd like to, as I say, once again, thank our three panelists, thank Alzheimer's Research UK for their sponsorship at this Conservative Party conference event, and also thank colleagues at Policy Exchange who put this event on with all the technical equipment and everything else. These things are not easy. There's a huge amount of work that goes in. So I'd like to personally thank them and their efforts. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation this morning. It's been unbelievably energizing. how can we bottle up these 6 months worth of progress and really transform patient lives is, I think, going to be something that we're going to be really looking at in our policy exchange work moving forwards. And I'd like to thank everyone and wish everyone a very good morning and rest of the conference. Thank you.